The psychologist Martin Seligman, who is known as really the father of positive psychology, he teaches at the University of Pennsylvania. He wrote a story that maybe some of you have heard in one of his recent books, and he talks about an ox. Now, this ox lives in an unusual spot. Off the coast of Portugal, there are a cluster of islands called Madeira, which is where they grow the grapes that make the Madeira wine that some of you may be familiar with. One of these islands in the cluster is a cylinder-shaped island. It has a very treacherous winding path that leads to the top, and on the top of the cylinder there's a plateau with just a few acres of a vineyard that grows these precious prized grapes. The ox who lives up there is the only constant living creature on the island, and his sole job is to tend to that field, to plow that field every year. Now, that ox will spend its entire life on the top of that plateau, and when it dies and finishes its work, another baby ox will be carried up on the shoulders of the farmer to the top of that plateau, where it will begin to plow that field and continue to live out the rest of its days. Seligman finishes that story by asking this question. If this story makes you sad, ask yourself why. You know, the ox has everything it needs. Probably has a lovely stable to live in, has all the food it wants, has some amazing real estate with ocean views in 360 degrees. Pretty nice lifestyle in a lot of respects. And yet there's something about that story and that ox's life that feels tragic to us. Mother Teresa was once asked about the people that she treated in her mission. And she talked about illness and sickness, and she said, but the interesting thing is, sickness in the East is different than the sickness in the West. In the East, we have diseases and viruses, illnesses, tuberculosis, things like that. She said, in the West, the disease that most people struggle with the most is loneliness. And she said, and in the West, it's a suffering from a lack of spirituality. I don't know if you know this or not, but I mentioned it last Sunday. In 2023, the Surgeon General of the United States put out an unprecedented report that said America is struggling and suffering right now with an epidemic of loneliness. And as I mentioned last week, it might occur to us initially that this is something that has to do with the pandemic, and it probably did, but really it started off even before that. And as Americans continue to be more and more obsessed with the idea of individualism and going about life by ourselves and being self-sufficient and not asking for help and not wanting to have others pitch in, because if we are true examples of success and bravery and courage in the American spirit, then we should be able to go it alone. But unfortunately, one of the great consequences of that is that it has led us into this place of withdrawal and isolation and loneliness, which has led to a whole host of other problems and concerns. And so this last week and the next couple of weeks, we want to look at this and talk about what is our responsibility as the church. When we see a sickness in society, is it not our responsibility to try to speak up about it, to address it, to try to talk about ways that we can combat that problem? And last week we talked about some of the practices that we might be involved in on an individual level, and today I want to look at what is our role as the church in this problem. About 9 days ago, we had a service here on a Friday afternoon, and it was a celebration of life for Jenna Kitchens. Now, at that service, there were a number of stories told about Jenna's amazing life, and I asked, at Skip's encouragement, if Lana Johnson, who was previously on the staff here, would come back and she would offer the closing prayer at that service. And she did a beautiful job, but she also took a moment to tell a story, and without her permission, I'm just going to go ahead and tell it anyway. She said that when she and her family of 3 were brand new to this neighborhood, they went to a brand new church called Liberty Crossings United Methodist, which would then become Grace United Methodist. And the church was meeting as a small congregation in the elementary school. That Sunday, they went and they visited the church, and they were greeted and they were welcomed, and everything went fine. And they were encouraged because, much like today, there was an event after church. There was a potluck that would take place later that night, and Lana and her family were encouraged to participate in the potluck dinner. And so they took a risk as newcomers, and they ventured out to the potluck dinner, and they went and they found a table after they had gone through the buffet line, and they sat in the corner by themselves because it seemed like everybody else already knew each other, and they were eager to talk to their friends, and who could help that? But Skip and Jenna grabbed their plates and went over and sat with Lana and Don and baby Hope at their table and remained there for the entire meal. And Lana said, if it weren't for the Kitchens family coming to sit with us at that meal, we probably wouldn't have been back. Sometimes the most powerful things that the church can do are the most simple. They're those ways of fostering connection. They're ways of finding and welcoming individuals and making them feel at home. They're a curiosity about our neighbor, and that comes from this strength and this deep conviction that we are stronger together. Amidst whatever may be our differences, no matter how superficial, coming together is part of what makes the fabric of the church work. Stephen read those two passages from Hebrews and Romans, two texts that probably were familiar to many of you. They are often cited in what is the responsibility of the church? How are we to conduct ourselves as Christian people? And I wanted to mention those today. I wanted those to be read because I think it's worth noting that even in the church's infancy, when the church was not even 100 years old, there was a deep desire to help people in the congregation to connect with one another, to look out for one another, to care for one another, to pray for each other. If somebody had a need, help them with the need. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Help those who are suffering. Come to the aid of the needy. These were values that were woven into the DNA of the church from its conception. This is what we are supposed to be about. The United Methodist tradition started out, you may remember, not really as a church that was meant to be its own denomination. It started off as a movement in England where two brothers, John and Charles Wesley, while they were still in college at Oxford, saw a lot of the behaviors of the Church of England becoming a little too relaxed. It had gotten a little bit too stiff, a little bit too predictable. Worship just felt like going through the motions, and it was sort of devoid of the kind of passion that they thought needed to be a part of the worship experience. And so they said something must be done about this. And so they met with a few like-minded people on their campus, and they started a club that would meet in the mornings, and they would meet, and they would sit down, and they would have prayer, and they would read scripture together, and they would check in with each other. How are you in this walk as a disciple, as a follower of Jesus? How are you doing in that? In which ways are you lagging behind? How can we help reinforce you? In which ways are things going well that we can inspire you and continue and encourage you to do more of that? And then that ministry began to look like servanthood and then evangelism. And so they would go to places where people were in need or suffering or hurting, and they would preach the good news of Jesus Christ to a community that was hurting or to people that were suffering. And people began to take notice, and they said, well, we want to be a part of this group. And more people wanted to participate in this group that was really a bunch of college kids for a while, but then the Wesleys said, well, it's gotten bigger. So what they began to do is they formed something called class meetings. And they said, we'll have groups of 8 to 12 people, and those classes will meet once a week in their communities, usually in people's houses. Then we'll come together, and they will ask an important question around the circle every time that they meet. And they will say, how is it with your soul? A simple question to ask and a difficult one to always respond to. But as those groups began to gel and the relationships began to form, the question became more and more natural, and they began to follow up on things that were listed as concerns in the weeks prior. And they would help one another and encourage one another for the things that were going well. And all of a sudden, this group became incredibly tight-knit, and the Wesleys said, and every Sunday, go back to your neighborhood church and go worship there, but then come back to your class meeting during the weekdays. And the Wesleys began small groups because they knew that if they were following the blueprint of the ancient church, that small groups and the relationships that happened between people would not only help combat loneliness and isolation, but they would help everybody participating to be accountable to this commitment that they have made to one another and to Jesus Christ, to be his disciples in the world. And so the class meetings begin to grow and thrive, and they began to grow so wildly that by the time many of those people moved across the Atlantic and set up shop populating the colonies in North America, those folks began to realize that perhaps as newcomers, as immigrants, as those who are struggling and suffering need small groups maybe more than ever before. And so the class meetings remained intact, and that is how we began as the United Methodist Church. Because those meetings turned into congregations, and those congregations turned into a denomination, and that denomination spread like wildfire across the colonies and the frontier moving west. Interesting is history, yes. But more important for what we're talking about today is the role that those groups and that tight-knit community end up having, becoming that glue that holds a church together. The first two bishops of the church were Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury. They felt so strongly about small groups that they said this: "We have no doubt that there are advantages to group Bible studies. But the most profitable exercise of all is free inquiry into the state of the heart." In other words, a small group that said, "How is it with your soul?" Isn't that fascinating? These are two men who would take the Bible more seriously than probably anybody you know. And yet they said, the Bible study is important. But the real thing that we need to be spending the majority of our time doing is not on a focus about inwardly looking about how can I be a better student of the Bible, but how can I be a better member of a community of faith and nurturing one another and supporting each other. On your way in this morning, you should have received a pamphlet that lists all of the small groups that meet on Sunday mornings and groups that meet during the weekdays. Now, we wanted to share this because this is the time of year as it's back to school time, and probably most of you have not gone back to school, but we can't help at the church but be a little bit on the school calendar anyway. And so as this is the time when summer planning and travel and activities are winding down and fall routines start to take place, I want to encourage you to be in prayer about this, maybe have some conversation at home. But this is the time when it would be very good for those of you who have been a part of a small group and maybe have fallen away a little bit to recommit yourself and reinvest yourself. For those of you who have been thinking about a small group and on the fence about that, maybe this is a good time for you to choose to try out one of them. There are 2 new small groups that will be starting in September after Labor Day, so that is September 7th, I think. And on that Sunday, we'll have some new groups starting up, and that'll be an opportunity for those who are looking for a brand new beginning and a group of people who want to come together to do just that very thing. But it occurs to me that as we have been a church that has moved through things like pandemics, schisms, and economic challenges and recessions and so forth, that the thing that has helped many of you stay bound to this body is the relationships and the connection that you have to one another. And so therefore, I encourage you to make that a priority. I think a small group is maybe the most obvious and easy way to do that. But for others of you, there may be other ways that you want to involve yourself in the life of the church or commit yourself more fully through acts of service or other opportunities where you continue to be in relationship with people. And this is important stuff, and we emphasize this every week. It's why we buy the most bougie donuts in town for you to enjoy some fellowship time before worship. It's why we say bring your coffee and your donuts in the sanctuary, which probably makes some of your grandmothers roll over in their grave, but we say that that is important because that is how we facilitate a culture of invitation and warmth and hospitality. We sign the attendance pads every week because we want you to know who's seated in the rows with you. We stand up and we take time in the precious hour of worship, even though it's going to be longer today, we take time to stand up and you get to greet each other for two minutes or so. It's 90 seconds, by the way. And that's when the lights dim and the music goes on, like in the lobby of the theater, right, where they're trying to remind you it's time to go back to your seats. And you just burn right through those 90 minutes every week because you want to talk to each other. And that's a beautiful thing. And it's why we are having hot dogs and water slides. Because nowhere in the Gospels does it say you must have a hot dog Sunday. In fact, the Old Testament speaks against it. But we do that because you get to come together for fellowship. That is why we do what we do. This is the glue that needs to be the bonding for the congregation. So I want to leave you with these words once more. They're short verses worth reading again. From Romans 12. Let love be genuine, hate what is evil, hold fast to what is good, love one another in mutual affection, outdo one another in showing honor. Do not lag in zeal, be ardent in spirit, serve the Lord, rejoice in hope, be patient in suffering, persevere in prayer, contribute to the needs of the saints, extend hospitality to strangers. And from Hebrews 10, and let us consider how to provoke one another to love and good deeds, not neglecting to meet together, as has been the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. Will you pray with me?